Hey everyone, this is Dan, and welcome back to Quiet Little Stories. Tonight I'm going to be sharing a tale from an experience that I had when I was 10 years old, and this would have been back in 1987, while I was with my father and my grandfather. But I'll get into the story in just a moment. I want to start off with a little disclaimer in the beginning of this, and I'd like to kind of make things clear before I go into the story, but I personally don't believe in Bigfoot. Now, I'm not going to shame others who do believe in Bigfoot, and I don't necessarily know exactly what we were dealing with in this story I'm about to tell you. But at the time that this happened, there was a very big sort of rash of sightings in and around the area that I'm going to be talking about. And when I was a kid, I loved Bigfoot stories, and I read Bigfoot books and everything, and trust me, I would love for Bigfoot to be a real thing, but it's just not something that I'm going to believe in until they find a body and science says, okay, this is Bigfoot. When that happens, it'll be a great day for all of us. But in the meantime, I'm going to share this story with you, and the reason that I said or mentioned Bigfoot in the title of this video is because I love clickbait. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. When I was a kid and this happened, my father was the first person to say it was Bigfoot. So, here's the story. When I think I was about 10 years old, my grandfather and my father bought a piece of property in a valley near Cape and Bridge, West Virginia. And the property was on the North River, and which kind of snakes through the hills and mountains there. And at the time, and I haven't been up there in a long time, but when I was a kid, it was very rural and very remote. The property that my grandfather and my father purchased was probably about 10, 15 miles off the main road. So you had to drive on a gravel road through backfields and in woods and over some hills and mountains and until you got to the property. So the plan was, when they bought this piece of property, was to build a house there. And it was to be a getaway from the hustle and bustle of suburban Maryland. And it was a beautiful place. There were tons of forest, trails, very remote. Only maybe 3 or 4 families lived out there at the time, and I don't have too many memories of the people there, but I think now there's more people that have moved into that area, into that region, so it's probably very different than it was back in 1987. But so this story begins in late fall, and my grandfather and father wanted to go up to the property, and they wanted to sink posts into the ground to begin the construction of this getaway house. And we drove up, and we stopped in Capon-Bridge, and they had a little newspaper in Capon-Bridge, and I can't remember the name of the newspaper, but it had on the front page, if I recall correctly, and when I was a kid I read, like I still read a lot, but I love to read, and this newspaper had a big kind of front page story about Bigfoot in Capon-Bridge. And it just seemed so incredible because when I was a kid and I would read these sort of Bigfoot books by like Daniel Cohen and other authors, you know, they only talked about Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest. And who would have thought that there was Bigfoot in West Virginia? So I was quite excited about it. And I was reading, and it said that this gentleman who was a farmer had seen a Bigfoot creature step over one of his barbed wire fences around his cattle field. And the creature had left some hairs on the barbed wire. And he was selling the hairs for $10,000 a strand. And I was just amazed by it. And there were actually a lot of stories at that time from that region about big people seeing Bigfoot. So me being a child with a very overactive imagination, when we got to the property where my dad and my grandfather were going to start working, you know, I just thought, wow, this is awesome. There could be Bigfoot up in the hills. It's watching us. And, you know, so it was very exciting for me. And anything back then, I mean, you didn't have like cell phones or anything like that. So, you know, you were basically out there cut off from the world, from everything. There was no phone. There was nothing at that time. And, I remember it was late fall because my grandfather and my father didn't want to go in the summer, the late summer, because it was too hot, and they wanted to get there before winter when the ground would freeze to sink these posts. And the reason that you would build a house on posts is because the river would flood. The river was prone to flooding, so when it would flood, it wouldn't flood your house because your house would be, you know, 7 or 8 feet off the ground. So my grandfather and my dad worked all day digging these holes. They dug them by hand, and they would sink the posts down into the hole and cover it up and whatever. And I remember it was Saturday, and this was the first time I had ever been up to West Virginia and the property. Now, I spent a lot of time after that up there, and I have more stories from there too that are great, but I'll get to those in later episodes of this series. So, it was getting near the end of the day, and my dad built a fire, and we had a tent, and my grandfather had a tent of his own, so I slept in the tent with my father, and my grandfather had a little tent that he slept in. And it was cold. I remember it was very cold. And around, I guess it was like 10 o'clock or so, I fell asleep. And my dad was at the fire. He had a big fire going. And we're in sort of like a field, or a little like prairie that's down in a valley. And we're about maybe, I guess, about 300 yards from the river. So the river is down there. Now, at that time, the river was not that full. It had a little bit of current to it, but it wasn't, it made a little bit of noise, but it wasn't like, if it were flooded, or if the level was lower and there was no noise at all. So my dad came in to go to bed, and I don't know what time it was, but he woke me up when he laid down, and I woke up and I couldn't go back to sleep, and I just kind of laid there, and I heard what sounded like somebody tearing through the bush on the opposite side of the river. Very loud and very kind of unnerving. My dad was already asleep, so I woke my dad up and I said, "Listen, I hear something across the river." And we sat there for a minute and listened, and we heard a little bit of stuff moving around, but he just said, "Oh, it's a deer," or whatever. Now, I will say this. In the 20 years or whatever that I went there, not once did I ever see a bear. Not once. Like, we were up there all the time and never saw a bear. I was all through the hills, all through the valleys and the river, everywhere. I'd never seen a bear up there. And I don't know anyone up there who had ever seen a bear. So, it may be different now, but at the time, it just wasn't an animal that you would see running around in this particular area of where we were. So, about, 20 minutes goes by, and the sound starts up again, and this time, the, whatever it is, had stepped into the river, and was crossing the river. And this caught my dad's attention, and he was listening, and he said it sounds like a person, and he opened up the tent, and the fire was just burning embers. It was, there was nothing left. There was no flame. It was just an orange pile of burning embers. And my dad went to the truck, and he grabbed his rifle. And he got back in the tent and closed the tent, and we just laid there, and he said, "Well, I don't hear anything. It's probably a deer." And that was that. And we didn't hear anything else, and I went to sleep. So about, I'm not sure what time it was, because, I didn't have a watch or anything, but I fell back asleep, and I woke up again, and my father was awake, and he was just sitting there, and he looked like he was kind of nervous, and I just kind of looked, and he put his hand on me, and he just looked at me like, he shook his head no, like, don't do anything. And you could hear breathing. It's probably about maybe 30 or 40 feet away from the tent, but it sounded like very heavy breathing, and it was very strange sound. It did not sound like anything that I've ever heard before. My dad, he was very nervous. He did not look, because I remember when I saw how scared he was, it kind of, made me scared as well. So whatever it was, and I still think that it was a person, a man, somebody who was, I'm not really sure, but whatever it was, it kind of grunted a little bit, like it almost sounded like a person, and then it turned and walked down towards the river, went into the river, went to the other side. We heard whatever was like in the brush, and it just took off, and we never heard anything for the rest of the night. And when it was walking away, that's when my dad was like, it's a person, because you could hear it didn't sound like it was four-legged. It sounded like it was two-legged. It was very creepy. And I just remember that night because it was so beautiful that night. It was clear, and you could see all the stars. And it was chilly, and the moon was out, and it was like the moon was kind of illuminating the field and the trees and everything. So it was just an eerie kind of experience that happened, and we don't know what it was. I don't know if we ever will know what it was. I think it was a person. That would be the logical, rational explanation. I could be wrong, but it's very, very crazy. I'll never forget that. And it's funny because it almost seemed like my dad kind of rewrote history a little bit. Like later on, he was kind of like, he kind of forgot details and stuff. But it's such an old story that it was really easy at that point to just kind of like, I don't think I've talked about this story for, oh my gosh. I mean, it's like at least 20 years. I don't think I've brought this up. So I wrote down little bits and pieces the other day because I wanted to share it with you guys. But that's the story. That's it. It's a great story. Next day, my father and my grandfather finished syncing the last couple posts, and we packed up camp and drove home. So, my grandfather didn't hear anything, but he slept through everything, so it didn't matter. But, anyway, you guys, hope you enjoyed this one, and, I'll be posting more of these, so stay tuned. There's a lot of stuff coming up on the channel, a lot of videos, a lot of new places, a lot of stuff to look at. It's just, there's just one of me. That's the problem. If I had two of me, I'd be able to get more out more often, but it's just really difficult. Anyway, make sure you visit shopdanbell.com to look at my prints. They're only $10, and it's a great little piece of artwork. You can get it home and frame it 5x7, very easy. And follow me on Twitter at This Is Dan Bell. Thank you guys very much. Bye-bye.